Okay, so in our continuation of discussion on the basics of Python, the next topic that we are going to discuss is looping or iterative statements. So we are here at our blog post. You see, the basic idea of looping is pretty simple. So imagine I have a piece of code. Suppose a equals to 10 plus 20 and print a. Right, now imagine I have to get the same thing done to be 20 times, right? That I want this print statement to print 30, then 30, all the way 30 for a total of 20 times, right? So one of the strategy would be to write print a statement for 20 times, which is not a good idea, because yes, we can write for 20, but imagine we are asked to do it for 100 times. Right, so then it doesn't make sense to write a single statement for 100 times, right? So this is where the loops in Python come into existence, right? So what it does, it allows us to execute piece of code n number of times. So n means any integer. It has to be an integer. It cannot be a floating point number or anything. It has to be a whole number, right? Like 10, 20, 30. Doesn't matter, right? So that is what we are going to discuss. So Python offers two type of statements, two type of loops. So one is called for loop and another is a while loop, right? So we'll discuss about them, and we will also see codes for it, but let's talk about loops in general. So loop that allows us to repeat a piece of code over and over again has basically three parts to it. It has basically three parts to it. The first is the initialization, right? The second part is, well, the sequence actually doesn't matter, but we are just talking about it. So initialization, then termination, right? And there should be some sort of a loop status count, right? So whatever kind of loop there is, or whatever format we write our code into, these three things has to be present, right? So imagine the game of cricket. Now let us talk about an over, right? That means 6 balls, right? Now it's a kind of an iterative or a looping process if you think about it, because every time a bowler will go in and put a ball. So this is a kind of a repetitive job. So we can demonstrate these three ideas with this example, right? So in here the initialization could be 1, right? So we start from first ball, right? And we know our termination condition, that is when the bowler will not bowl anymore, when we have reached 6 balls, right? Whenever we reach 6 balls, that particular bowler will not bowl anymore, right? So this is our start, this is our stop. So we are aware of both these conditions, and it is very much required, right? And the third interesting thing is that the count of number of balls. Right? And that is what the umpire is for. So umpire is some sort of mechanism who will count the number of balls. Now if we don't have, now just imagine if we don't have an umpire, what will happen? So obviously we'll start from the first ball, but there is no mechanism to keep count. So we'll not never reach this condition, and one single bowler can bowl forever. Now this has a terminology in programming language called as an infinite loop, right? That is a loop that never terminates. So we'll look into all of these things. So again, let me reiterate. So a loop must have an initialization condition, a termination condition, and a loop status count, right? So now this count can be an increment, right? Or it can be a decrement. So what does it mean? Increment means additions or increment, right? It's not necessarily addition. It can be multiplication also. Decrement means basically subtraction or some sort of a division. That is what's going to actually decrease the count. That is what actually going to decrease the count, right? This was all about the basic of the loops, right? That what a loop will contain. Now we will jump over to something called as a for loop, right? And this is what is also explained in our blog post. So it will have an initialization or a starting condition, a stopping condition or termination condition, and a loop count, right? Increment or decrement, that is how the state is being changed, right? So we are going to talk about something called as a for loop and a while loop, right? Two variants that are available. So in other programming language like in C, C++, you have something called as a do while loop. So well, that is not required. Most of the time you don't even use it, right? So we'll talk about for loop, its syntax, and then we'll actually practice it, right? So we'll have a for, then a variable usually used to initialize as well as keep track of it in some sort of an iterator, right? Some sort of an iterator or a sequence. So we'll talk about it, what an iterator or what a sequence can be, and then we will have colon. Then obviously, as usual, we need to have indents, that is basically 4 spaces and 1 tab, right? So these are actually equivalent. Either you use 4 space or 1 tab will give an indent that is necessary, and then we will have statements, right? Multiple statements are possible, and obviously Python gives something of unique sort, that it can have something called as an else, right? Now what else does that? Whenever this particular for loop will terminate, that is its stopping condition has been reached or something of that sort, else clause gets executed by default. Now this is not mandatory. If you want, you can put it. If you don't want, you don't have to put it, right? So we'll now jump over to our Jupyter notebook and see it in practice. So now let's start with the for loop. For I in range. So now range is a function that generates a sequence. So for 5 times I'm going to run it, right? And we will also see what are the different variation of range, right? And we'll see the very simplest example, print hello. Now it's a string, so it has to be inside inverted commas, else it's not going to work. So if I execute it, so as you can see, I have 5 hellos printed over here, right? So this is how it works. Now what about I? Okay, so this is a very important thing. We have to understand it. That I is keeping a track of this particular sequence. So what are the particular values of I, right? So now if I try and put a comma, because we know that in print we can put multiple arguments using comma and everything gets disclosed. So I can write something of that sort, right? I, which will have the count, comma, just to make it look nice. Well, first doesn't make sense, right? So I'll just keep it like that. I'll just put a space in between so that everything looks nice and tidy. And if I run it, so you see 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So these are the values of I, right? So as we discussed in here, that it needs to have certain condition, that is initialization. So if I jump over to here, so my initialization is 0, that is I starting from 0, and my termination or stopping condition is 4 till it reaches 4. So this is what range actually gives us. Range gives us a value because we have put 5 values, so it will start from 0, it will go all the way up to 4, right? That is n minus 1. Now I can change the behavior if I want to. If I want it to start from 1, I can write 1, 5. So it will start from 1, but it will go up to 4, that is 5 minus 1, that is n minus 1. Whatever the value is here, if you consider it to be an n, so n minus 1, right? So now if I run it, let's see how it works. So as usual, it starts from 1 and it goes all the way up to 4, right? So that's why we have 4 hellos in place of 5. So now if I put you see 6 in here, then obviously I'll have my 5 hellos in here. Does it make sense? So again, I will have the values from this particular range, right? So again, I can also put else in here. Else, I'll just write something of this sort. Loop, I'll double up it, right? Exited, something of that sort. And as we discussed earlier, this statement gets evaluated by default. We don't have to concern ourselves. So if you need some sort of mechanism where you want that once the loop has ended, I want to display something, then it is done, else it is not required in most of the cases, right? So does it make sense? So this was about our for loop, a very simple implementation, right? So we have for a variable, a sequence, then as many statements as we want, and then we have an else clause also, right? So there is a small example where we are printing it, so I guess it will make sense. So I'll just introduce another topic in here, something called as a nested loop, right? Though it can be talked about later on, but I'll talk in here. So now, as we had discussed in our if clause, that we can nest multiple if statements within each other. Similarly, we can do it for statement also, like loops also. Nested loops are also possible. So now for this code, if I start from 1 to 4, I'll just get it done like the previous one, so as to make it simpler. I'll remove this, right? So a very simple output, it's get executed 5 times, right? So now we are pretty sure that this particular hello will get executed 5 times. Now let us modify this code. For I in range of 5. Fine. Now I'll go inside and I'll write another for loop for j in, doesn't matter, we are assigning any random variables. Now usually I is the prefer, I and j are the prefer value, but it doesn't matter, you can put ABC, doesn't matter, except it should not be a keyword, we know that. So if I put 5 in here, and then again I have to put a tab print hello, right? Now how many times do you think it will actually get printed? Now these idea of nested for loops are very much important, and we have to understand it precisely, because we'll have some complicated questions which cannot be solved without a nested for loop, right? So if I execute it, what happened? Oh, I missed a colon. Shouldn't miss a colon. Yes. Now we can see that actually we are having a hello in here. So why is it that? Because this particular inner statement will run for 5 times for each outer statement. That is, for each outer statement, the inner for loop will run for 5 times. So that's why 5 multiplied by 5 gives us 25. So we have a total of 25 hellos in here. So does it make sense? Okay. So now what we are going to do, we are going to dissect this code and understand how a nested loop behaves. So let us rewrite our piece of code for I in range of, I'll put a small number, maybe 3, right? Because I'm not going to write the entire range, that will be humongous. And then we have another for j in range of 2. I'm not going to write very complex big numbers, because then I have to just write everything on the paper and that doesn't make sense. I'll just write hello, right? So I can tell you that it is going to print hello for basically 6 times. Why? Because 3 times 2 is 6. Now let us try and understand what's actually happening. So I'll write a table of I and j, because there are only two counters in here, right? I and j. So initially, as we know, if 3 is there, the range will start values from 0, 1, 2. It will not reach 3, right? We know that. Either I'll have 0, I have 1, and I'll have 2, right? So initially I'll start with 0 in value. So once I is 0, we'll go inside this particular for loop and we'll start. Again, j will have values from 0 and 1, because the extreme limit is 2 and it never reaches 2, right? So that means this hello will get printed 2 times. Hello and hello. Now the similar behavior will happen for this also. I'll have 0 and 1. That is, when this particular iteration gets over, we'll jump over to parent loop the outer loop, and then the value of I will be 1, and we will be here, and then again we will go inside the inner loop. Inner loop will execute for 2 times, so it will print hello and hello, right? So this gets over. After printing 2 hellos, it will just move over to outer loop again. Now the value of I is 2, so again when we'll have this value, we'll jump over to inner loop, we'll again have 0 and 1, and again it will print hello and hello 2 times, right? Because this loop is running for 2 times. So in total we have 6 hellos in here, right? So that is how this particular nested loop behaves. Now we have to understand that these are very much important topic, and we have to understand this idea and its behavior. Now you have from this you do understand that this is some sort of you see multiplicative behavior. So if my outer loop is 5 and inner loop is 5, then I have 25, right? 25 times my inner loop will get executed, right? So in this behavior, so we have to be very much careful. Now we can nest as many we want, right? It is not mandatory that we will only have 2. I can have multiple for loops as I want, and I can nest them. But as you see, it will go multiplicative very easily. So some sort of n to the power j or something, right? So you can understand it's some sort of an exponential behavior. And we do understand that exponential curves are very much inefficient in terms of computer science. It will hog your resource very easily. So, too much of nestation of loops is not a good idea. It will make our program very slow, right? So this was all about for loops. I guess it makes sense. Again, now we can go to our blog post and we can check the questions and example that has been given. They are very naive and simple, right? So next we will move over to while loop, right? So let me explain while loop a bit, and then we'll jump over to coding. Similar kind of behavior, only the syntax is different. So we'll have while, and then we will have some sort of a condition, right? Oh, sorry, only colon. Right, we will have some sort of a condition, then we'll have statements. Now then we need to have some sort of a count or loop count, right? And as you remember, we need to have some sort of an initialization, right? So these 3 things, an initialization, a condition, and a count, they have to be there, these 3 things. Without them, it's not going to work. So what we are going to do, the for loop that we have written earlier, we'll try to convert it to a while loop so that we can put a comparative idea. So let's jump over to our Jupyter notebook. So what we are going to do, we are going to map this particular piece of code, right? So I'll just copy it and I'll paste it in here and I'll execute. So it's behaving normally. Now I'll try to replicate this behavior. So what I'm going to do, I is equal to 0, right? So that is how you declare a variable. So after that we'll have while I is less than 5, okay, colon, print hello, right? And after that we'll have some sort of increment, right? I plus equals 1. So we do remember this operator when we discussed assignment operator. So if you don't understand this particular piece of code, go back to assignment operator where we talk about the combination of arithmetic and assignment operators together, right? So now we will execute it. As you can see, both our outputs are exactly same. So here we have 5 hellos and here also we have 5 hellos. So that is how both the loops can be interchanged in between, right? So again, I started from 0 all the way to 4. Again, we have done the same. These are initialization condition where I has started from 0 and it has reached all the way less than 5, that is 4, right? And we have incremented the value. Now we can increment, we can decrement, we can multiply, divide, everything is possible, right? Now these are very much important. If we forget any of this attribute, we'll infinite loop. Again, we can put an else clause. So we can write a print statement, loop exited. So the behavior is altogether same. So I guess it makes sense. So we have discussed about the loop, its syntax, that is we need an initialization of some sort, statements, and we have also written a program in it. Okay, so now the obvious question is that if both for loop and while loop can behave in a similar way, so is there a preference, or how do I decide which one to use? If I'm not sure about how many times my loop is going to execute, now in here I was sure that okay, my loop is going to be executed for 5 times, right? So in that scenario, you can either use a for or a while loop, doesn't matter, both will work. But if you're not sure that how many times my loop is going to run, right, in that scenario, while loop is our choice, a for loop is not going to help, right? So imagine I want to write a particular code. I'll just show you, right? Okay, so now let's try and understand this piece of code. You see, in here I'm not sure how many times this is going to run. It's completely based on the user's input. Now we'll discuss about input output later on. So it's entirely based on the user's input. So if user keeps on pressing Y, if I keep on pressing Y, this loop will continue, right? So in this scenario, I cannot actually, you see, put a for loop, because a for loop is not an efficient idea in here. So again, how do we decide which one to use? Whenever we're not sure that how many times my loop is going to run, then while loop is our choice, right? And when we are sure that our loop is going to run for n number of times, for loop is the thing, or we can use while loop also, right? Now the moment I press n in here, right, so we can see that this particular loop has come to an end. So does it make sense? Again, when we are sure about the number of times the iteration or the looping should happen, then either for or while can be used. But when we are not sure that how many times my loop will execute, then while is our obvious choice. You see, now this is a condition. That means whenever it is true, only then remaining statements will execute. The moment it gets false, we are going to exit out of it, right? So does it make sense? So this was all about loops, while and for loop. So this was the basic idea. Again, the more practice we do, the more we'll understand. So stay tuned, and thanks for watching.